Good morning, everybody. Good. And just like that, whoosh, the week has gone. But we're here on the final day, and I hope you've had an absolutely wonderful and fulfilling week. We have a couple of announcements before we get started. My name is Jean, and I'm the Associate Rep for IATEFL. If you are a student or you are an early careers teacher, that means you're within your first 3 years of your ELT career, I'm really happy to tell you that you qualify for a discount for membership. So take that opportunity, and if you go to the registration desk today, in addition to that discount, you also get 15 months for the price of 12. So that is an amazing opportunity, so I do hope you manage to cash in on that. I'll also talk to those of you who are parts of teaching associations in your areas. If you are a member of a teaching association who is an associate of IATEFL, you are also eligible for a greatly discounted membership with IATEFL. So again, this is something, please do look into that. Contact your local associations and see if they are associates. And to those of you who are in the room who are maybe members of committees of teaching associations who are not associates, please do get in contact with us. Becoming an associate of IATEFL is free for your association, and we do offer a number of really, really good benefits to your members. So thank you very much. Those were this morning's announcements. And now let's turn to the important part of the day, where I am very, very honoured to present Rose Aylett. So I first met Rose when we were working on a project together. It was a collaboration between IATEFL, British Council and English UK. It was the Prelim project, probably some of you have heard of it. And in fact, I ended up working with Rose on all 3 Prelim projects. Rose, I should mention, is a freelance CELTA trainer. She is a training consultant with Niall, and it was Niall who were coordinating this project. Rose's role here was to support and facilitate cooperation between teaching associations from all around the globe and a partner UK institution. And this was my first insight into Rose's enthusiasm for engaging with and understanding the interplay between culture and education. Rose has a great love for the outdoors. She's a keen hiker, and I was astounded to find out goes swimming every morning before the conference, not in a heated pool, but in the sea. So, but it is this love for the outdoors and the environment which goes beyond her immediate environment and extends further. Her desire to promote love for the environment that she's in encompasses the globe and, by extension, the people in it. Her start was in theology, philosophy, and Islamic studies, all the while becoming an educator herself. CELTA at 18, coming to her first IATEFL conference here in Brighton in 2011, going on to do her Delta and eventually her MA in professional development in language education. Rose continued her journey with IATEFL by becoming the Global SIGs coordinator, the Global Issues SIG coordinator, and podcaster between 2020 and 2023. She also coordinated the Global Issues e-zine called Futurity, keeping her interest with global cultures and social justice always at the forefront of her interests. But it was on her master's degree where the paths of all of her interests and enthusiasms met up, on a thesis on critical pedagogy. The thesis laid a foundation for a teacher training course called Global Citizenship in Language Education, looking at how teachers can engage in critical dialogue, holding difficult conversations about social justice and global issues in the classroom, and criticals material analysis. Both of these are important elements in critical literacy, which is what she's going to be reflecting on and talking about today. So please join me in finding out more about critical literacy by welcoming Rose Aylett to the stage today.
Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here. And thank you, Jean, for such a lovely introduction. Also, a big thank you to IATEF for the invitation to speak to you all this morning. The last of 4 academic IATEF plenaries this year, I believe, for the first time, all delivered by women. So congratulations to IATEF for giving space front and centre to female voices and expertise. I hope you've enjoyed the festival of teaching and learning that is IATEF, because it is a bit like a festival, isn't it? You start the week feeling like this, full of energy, ready to network and soak up all that CPD, but then after walking several consecutive marathons around the conference venue, and when the sugar high from those little cupcakes you get at the exhibition stand starts to wear off and cognitive overload sets in, by the end of the week, maybe you feel a bit more like this. For many of you, this might be the point you're at now. You're just congratulating yourself to making the Friday morning plenary with your hair brushed. If that's you, thank you for joining us. I'm really going to try and make this worth getting out of bed for. So let's get stuck in. This talk is about criticality, and I'm specifically here referring to criticality as an analysis of power. I'm going to divide the talk up into 3 parts. First, I'm going to begin with a bit of background, the relationship between language and power and education. In the second part, we're going to look at critical literacy. We're going to explore a useful model for critical literacy that can be applied to different texts and discourses. And finally, to finish up, we're going to explore the application of this framework to our work in language education. We'll both look at how we can view teaching practice through a critical literacy lens, as well as posing critical questions to other institutions and bodies in the wider field of ELT. I'm going to make the case that, as language teachers, we should be uniquely concerned with critical literacy, because developing our students and our own ability to question relationships of power is fundamental, I believe, if education is to make a positive difference in the world outside of our classrooms. And I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm going to be really unapologetic about this, which is probably the most British thing you'll hear ever said at this conference. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about me. Perhaps like some of you in the room today, I didn't always want to be a teacher. My first choice of career when I graduated was actually to become, and I didn't tell you this, Jean, a Metropolitan Police officer. The Metropolitan Police are the force that look after and work in Greater London. And so this is where I applied, and what I applied to do when I graduated and left university. And if you look closely in this photo and count from the left, you'll see me, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not in this photo. I never joined the police. I was going to, though. I applied, I got my security clearance, I passed all the assessments, health checks and fitness tests. But then in 2009, there was a general election, which resulted in a change of the UK government. As quickly as you could utter the word austerity, the funding for my training at Hendon Police Academy vanished, and with it, my dreams of becoming a detective inspector. Now, there are not many things in the UK that we can thank the former British Prime Minister David Cameron for, but I suppose one of them is that I work in ELT still, and I'm here standing talking to you today, instead of policing the streets of Brexit Britain. In another life, I might have been employed to enforce the power of the state, whereas here I am in a room full of educators, encouraging you to use a different kind of power, the power of language, to critique, deconstruct, and disrupt. So, part 1. The kind of power I might have had I joined the police, Sian Waring calls political power. It's the power held by people in positions of authority whose jobs give them the right to affect and control other people's lives. That includes people like judges, lawmakers, the police, prison wardens, and sometimes doctors. But you don't have to do those kind of jobs to have power. We all have, albeit to varying degrees, what Waring calls personal power. This is the individual power that we have based on the roles we play in society. For example, the power we might have as a parent, as an employer, as consumers, or as I'm going to show, in our role as teachers, especially language teachers with a class full of students. The third kind of power Waring identifies is social group power. This is power held by a group of people due to certain social factors such as class, ethnicity, gender, age, etc. It's often referred to as privilege. If you're a wealthy, white, cisgender male, you won't necessarily have more power, but you're more statistically likely to have greater status and power relative to other groups with less social status and fewer economic resources, and who are therefore more frequently discriminated against. So, almost all of us have a degree of power. It varies, sometimes we have more, sometimes less of it, depending on the social context, the moment in time. Because power is fluid and dynamic. Power exists between individuals, groups of people, or organizations, anywhere there is a social relationship, including schools. Schools are not politically neutral places, and education doesn't take place in a power-free vacuum. As the following headlines show, this means that things like the content of the curriculum, the manner and purpose for which students are assessed, and how their achievements are celebrated, what learners can wear, the food they get to eat, how teachers are paid, who teachers and students can be, the question of who deserves to be educated at all, or who should even be allowed to teach. All of this reflects existing structures of power. And let's not forget that it's not only teaching and learning that is impacted by the political climate in which it operates, but it's also affected by the actual climate too. That's right, these days, even the weather is highly political. So, how we educate, what we say, how we act, what we do, the questions we ask, the materials and methods we use in our classes are all value-laden. And this can contribute to reinforcing and affirming the status quo, or seeking to change and challenge it. This also applies to what we don't do, what we don't say, don't address, and don't question. Failing to act, the things we overlook and ignore, also reflects our values. Education might reflect personal values, the values of our institution, the prevailing culture of the society in which we're teaching, or our own, the values of our government. Most likely it's a combination of these. The idea that educators perpetuate power dynamics, ways of interacting and existing in the world by not acting as well as by acting, stems, of course, from the work of the Brazilian pedagogue Paulo Freire. In his seminal work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire argued that education could be socially transformative in nature. He suggests that the classroom cannot be separated from the wider social context in which it's embedded, and so what happens in the classroom should end up making a difference outside. And this is particularly important for us as language teachers, because one of the most important ways in which power is exercised or accomplished is through language use. But it's also through the critique of how language is used, by using language to challenge and resist, that existing systems and structures of power can be dismantled and social transformation can occur. We can see examples of how language works like this in the media, for example, in the headlines I've just shared with you. Let's take a look at just one of them and examine how power is embedded in the language used there. So this headline is taken from an opinion piece on the Al Jazeera website, Al Jazeera English, I should say. The article is written by Mariam Ahmadi, which is a pseudonym for an anonymous Afghan women's rights activist. Because it's an opinion piece, it's perhaps not unusual to see a first-person pronoun in the title. However, the use of the first-person singular here serves to emphasize the author's extreme isolation, both from other teachers and her students in a country where girls are currently banned from studying beyond the age of 11. And the act of teaching then comes with a huge risk to personal safety. The use of assonance, repetition of vowel sounds in two nearby words, draws our attention to this unusual collocation, to teach in secret, emphasizing its peculiarity. The following two verbs, defying and the figurative fighting despair, are highly emotive and convey a sense of the author's strength and power, positioning her as a combatant in the face of her oppression. The present participle ing form here also expresses activity. The implication is that this is a positive act of resistance in a country where few are possible, and the intention is to arouse the reader's sympathy, but also admiration at this teacher's courage and bravery. This is just one headline, but look at how much hidden meaning can be embedded within such a short text. We know that journalists and the media seek to influence their audience and wield power through their language use. Another domain where power is very obviously performed through language is in politics itself. Political power is exercised by means of language through speeches, debates, TV appearances, newspaper interviews, and of course these days on social media. One common feature of political rhetoric is the three-part statement, or rule of three. Three-part statements are as popular with the parliamentary speechwriter as the political activist, but they're also found in national mottos, campaign literature, protest slogans, warning signs, as well as in advertising and marketing campaigns. Supposedly, three related words or ideas expressed or presented in quick succession are more memorable, more persuasive, and ultimately more powerful. Some examples: liberté, égalité, fraternité. See it, say it, sorted. Black Lives Matter. Stay home, save lives, protect the NHS. No means no. Stop, look, listen. Just do it. And of course, the now notorious get Brexit done. But it isn't only politicians, advertisers, and journalists that use language to persuade and influence. Power is embedded in the language of everyday interactions and the way we communicate with one another. For example, the way a business communicates with its clients, or the way we speak to our students, reinforces a particular power dynamic between these different social actors. I spent this week listening out for examples at the conference to illustrate this. There were loads to choose from. I've selected just 4. So in a moment, you're going to see something that someone said somewhere at some point this week, and now you're all going to get really nervous about what you've said. Because I'm calling this section Overheard at IATEFL. So for each example, I would like you to try and silently identify one feature of language in this sentence that reveals a relationship of power. Here we go. Okay, so you might have picked up their forms of address, like ma'am, sir, ms, doctor, etc., as well as post-nominal letters which indicate civil honours, military honours, appointments, or qualifications. These are one way of indicating status and power, in particular if a person insists that you use them or that you don't use them. If Sir David Crystal said, "Please, call me Dave," he'd be effectively relinquishing some of that power and attempting to balance the power dynamic in the conversation. The second, number 2. So in our second, you might have identified the use of the passive voice to obscure the social agent or agents. Who is it exactly that is asking conference delegates to follow these rules? Is it the Brighton Centre? Is it IATEFL, head office, the board of trustees, the wider membership? Do they all individually agree on this? And more importantly, is it possible or even healthy to spend a whole week talking exclusively about ELT? Okay, so the next. So this one is interrupting or overlapping speech, which is, of course, another indicator of who holds power in spoken discourse, but also its opposite when a person doesn't give way or concede the turn. Dominant participants in a conversation tend to talk the most, take the lead, and establish the topics of the conversation, whilst more submissive participants usually avoid interrupting, listen more, and follow changes in topic. And finally, because let's be honest, many conversations at IATF will happen at the bar. The last one, that's right, the imperative. So imperatives are often used with those with more power to instruct, direct, or order someone, usually with relatively less power to do something. For example, telling the bar staff how your pint will be paid for. So there are many different ways that language foregrounds, backgrounds, highlights, or obscures. Sometimes it's not what is said or written, but what is left unsaid or unwritten, or the decision not to use particular terminology to describe groups of people, places, identities, events, or ideas. Language can be used to enforce power, but also to challenge and resist it. A really interesting example of this was brought to my attention at the conference in Harrogate last year. Yaroslava Fedorov, one of the presenters at the Global Issues Showcase, traveled from Kyiv in central Ukraine to share her experiences of teaching during wartime. In her talk, she described how her students and others up and down the country were refusing to capitalize the word Russia in an act of defiance against Putin's invasion. And it had actually become a bit of a problem, she said, because the practice was so widespread that her students were submitting academic papers without the capitalization, and she didn't want to mark them down for punctuation. However, in September last year, this powerful act of linguistic resistance was acknowledged and formalized by the Ukrainian National Commission on State Language Standards, which declared that in unofficial text, writing words like Russia and Moscow in lowercase would no longer be considered a deviation from the norms of the Ukrainian language. So we've seen a number of examples of how power is performed through language. If critical applied linguists like Norman Fairclough and Alistair Pennycook are right, the exercise of power in modern society is increasingly achieved through the ideological workings of language, and language learning is closely connected with the maintenance of these inequalities and the conditions required to address them. If this is the case, then this has clear implications in our work as language educators. Language teachers do more than just teach the language. Language can be emancipatory. Some might even say that language teaching is as political as it is linguistic. So this brings us on to part 2 of this morning's talk and the subject of critical literacy. What is it exactly? Concepts of critical literacy stem from and are influenced by the work of the Frankfurt School in the 1920s, and beginning in the late 1940s, the work of Paulo Freire. For Freire, reading was not just a mechanical process. It wasn't just about decoding words. Reading the word involved simultaneously reading the world. The way we read any text, he claimed, is mediated through our day-to-day lived experiences. Definitions of literacy are continually developing. In recent years, this evolution has seen a shift in understanding from literacy as a concrete set of skills towards what people do with literacy. Critical literacy is just that. Rather than a toolkit, it's a perspective for teaching and learning, a way of being both in the classroom and outside. Unfortunately, research on critical literacy in the ELT context is scarce. However, there have been many attempts to define it in the wider educational literature through various different frameworks. In this talk, I'm going to focus exclusively on one of these, and this is this one, Mitzi Lewison, Amy Seeley-Flint, and Katie Vance-Lewis's 2002 4-dimensions model. I'm focusing on this one as it's a synthesis of all the key conceptualizations of critical literacy for around 30 years prior to their study, and I'll be referring to this as Lewison's framework for the rest of the talk. This paper and all of my references will be on the final slide. So, what is critical literacy? Lewison and her colleagues define it as disrupting the commonplace, interrogating multiple viewpoints, focusing on socio-political issues, taking action and promoting social justice. Just take a moment now and think silently for a few seconds. What do you think the 4 dimensions could mean or refer to in relation to literacy? don't worry if you're not sure. We're going to go through each one by one. And later on, we're going to examine how each of these 4 dimensions can be practically applied to our work in language education. So the first dimension of critical literacy outlined in the Lewison framework is the one I've chosen for the title of this talk, Disrupting the Commonplace. This is the explanation given in the study. Disrupting the commonplace is all about seeing the everyday through new lenses. It means using language to identify our implicit assumptions and ways of perceiving the world, and considering alternative ways of understanding experience. It means asking, how is language used to keep things as they are? A key part of this is the ability to identify what is described by Lewison and her colleagues as the commonplace, or the everyday. The dominant prevailing narratives or assumptions that we make, that we may believe to be self-evidently true. Many of these we won't even be aware of. Narratives like that the pursuit and progressive attainment of more and more material wealth will make us happy. Or the idea that your wedding day will be the best day of your life. That a wedding should be between a man and a woman, and that you should really only ever have one. Whether they be our own beliefs and values or ones we encounter, in disrupting the commonplace, these narratives are foregrounded and questioned. Okay, let's move on to the second dimension of the framework, interrogating multiple viewpoints. The authors summarize this as follows. This dimension of the framework describes the ability to understand and experience texts from our own perspectives, as well as the viewpoints of others, to explore conflicting perspectives, to seek out those that might be missing and ask why. And like all 4 of the dimensions of the framework, a critical literacy stance can be applied to visual texts, as well as written ones. Take, for example, this image of 5 climate activists meeting to raise awareness of the issue at the annual World Economic Forum in Davos. This image is a few years old now. It was taken in 2020 by an Associated Press photographer, but it went viral for all the wrong reasons. And I didn't make a mistake there. There are actually 5 activists in the photo. The image was cropped by the photographer before publication, according to Associated Press, purely for compositional reasons. This is what the original looked like. On the left, you can now see the 5th activist, the Ugandan Vanessa Nakate, where she was standing alongside her 4 white colleagues. One of the things that makes this story particularly poignant, I think, is the fact that the person who was removed was the same one who was attending the conference to represent communities most likely to be directly affected by the climate emergency. In erasing Vanessa, the photographer also erases the already disenfranchised victims of the climate crisis. This second dimension of critical literacy prompts us to question written, spoken, and visual texts, to ask who is missing, silenced, or marginalized. It also encourages us to reflect on different perspectives. Perhaps without the building in the background, the composition of the photo is improved and there was no malintent, as claimed by an AP spokesperson. However, this dimension also involves going beyond words or visuals to read texts as situated within wider societal discourses, in this case, those of racism and the eradication of voices of people of color. For me, another crucial aspect in this second dimension that we might not always think about is that of the living, non-human beings that are quite literally voiceless. Identifying and amplifying the interests of our natural world, plants, insects, animals, whole living ecosystems, is fundamental to both social and environmental justice and key to being critically literate, I think. Let's move on to the third dimension, focusing on socio-political issues. As we've already seen, education, learning, and teaching is not a neutral activity, and schools are not apolitical spaces. However, the authors of the framework highlight that education often does take place without any acknowledgement of how socio-political systems, power relations, and language are embedded within our practice. This is how they conceptualize focusing on the socio-political. So this dimension is about challenging ourselves and our students to step outside of our own experience to interrogate how larger socio-political structures position people in the world. One example of this might be helping students to understand how language can be used to marginalize or other people through use of a particular style of writing or inaccessible vocabulary. This is sometimes called linguistic gatekeeping. It's the activity of controlling and usually limiting someone's access to something through means of language use. It can include language like jargon, technological terminology, academic discourse, or management speak. Research has shown how refugees and asylum seekers in particular pay a kind of linguistic penalty when moving into a new socio-economic environment, with language being used as a gatekeeper for inclusion or exclusion. For example, regulating access to citizenship, education, health, and legal protection. In recent years, New Zealand has even taken upon itself to legislate against this. So this third dimension of the framework involves investigating and critiquing how language is used as a means to create and maintain unequal power structures and systems. The fourth dimension of the framework is often taken to be the definition of critical literacy. But the authors are keen to stress that one can't take informed action against oppression or promote social justice without the understandings and perspectives gained from the other three dimensions as well. So let's take a look at the fourth and final dimension. When we think about taking action for social justice, we might associate this with direct political action, like joining a protest march or strike, holding a sit-in or attending a vigil. But if critical literacy is a stance, then it isn't simply a one-off event or something you turn on or off depending on your context, but an ongoing practice of analyzing and using language to question power relations. It is also, I believe, more important now in the 21st century than it's ever been in the history of humankind. The way we consume, process, and share information has radically changed in just the last few decades, and governments, the mainstream media, and the rest of us are still only just catching up. We not only have more information at our fingertips through ever-improving access to the internet globally, but we're also exposed to a much wider range of genres of written, spoken, and visual text. But perhaps most importantly, in this information age, we're also exposed to a vast array of different sources of information, which increasingly will include generative AI. Often these sources are deliberately concealed, so the ability to read texts and discourse critically to combat misinformation, disinformation, and fake news is more important now than ever before. For me, critical literacy is absolutely fundamental to language education. And in the remaining minutes of this talk, it's how we embed it in our work that I would like to turn to. So in this final part, I want to invite you to view our work, the practices and activities that we engage in, as well as the systems, structures, and organization of language, English language particularly, education, through this critical lens. The Four Dimensions framework can be applied to written and spoken texts, but it can also apply to whole discourses, such as recruitment practices, marketing strategies, conferences, or even a whole academic discipline. So to help visualize this, I've created this simple model in order for us to be able to critique our own practices, institutions, and our wider field. Here, the three concentric rings each represent a different layer of our work, At the centre, we have teaching practice, which is where we'll start. So I've divided teaching practice into 4 subsections: methodology, materials, assessment, and classroom interactions. Let's first look at the methods we adopt in our classrooms and training sessions. The idea that there's one best method that can be universally applied to teaching and learning languages is an area that's been long critiqued in the field of applied linguistics. Language teaching methods are defined by Noonan as a single set of procedures which teachers follow in the classroom, usually based on a set of beliefs about the nature of language and learning. One of the main critiques of the idea of the method is that it privileges expert knowledge, that's in inverted commas, that the expert knowledge of academics in their ivory towers. And these are ivory towers overwhelmingly located in the native speaker West. And this is prioritized over teachers' knowledge, and this unfairly suggests that there might be some kind of deficiency in teachers' understanding of their own practice. Pennycook argues that the concept of method is one way of maintaining dominant power structures and accuses the construct of perpetuating colonial, patriarchal, and oriental views of language and education. Applied linguistics and ELT has now moved on to a post-method era, and it's generally accepted that there's no one best method for all, that different methods are suitable in different contexts, and a more pragmatic, context-sensitive approach, the kind of principled eclecticism, is the best way forward. Instead, it could be argued that the search for the best method has now been replaced with the search for the best coursebook. As in so many schools today, the coursebook now is the method. Akbari describes contemporary language teaching as an era of textbook-defined practice. What the majority of teachers teach and how they teach, he says, are now determined by textbooks. Thornbury agrees, stating that the concept of method is not only alive and well, but has been reincarnated in the form of coursebooks, since it's the coursebook series that more than any other factor determines and defines current teaching practice. This then makes an ability to critique and deconstruct our course materials an essential component of a critical language pedagogy. A good place to start might be by exploring and critiquing some of the dominant narratives surrounding materials development. One prominent one is the idea that there is no place in our classrooms for materials on which students might have strong but opposing opinions. If you haven't seen these strange-looking yellow carrot-like things before, they're called parsnips. Parsnip is also an acronym. It's often used in ELT, particularly publishing, to represent these kind of controversial issues that are considered too taboo for audiences of global published materials. The first P in parsnips is politics, and this is what the other letters stand for. Isms refers to ideologies, systems of belief like communism, totalitarianism, atheism, or feminism, for example. So taking a critical approach, we would want to ask not only which topics are not covered in our course materials, but why this is the case. Who has an interest in omitting them from our classrooms? Are their reasons legitimate and best for our learners? One way of taking action might be to cease referring to these as controversial issues and treating them somehow as inherently problematic, but instead to term them as critical issues, because they are issues that require context-sensitive critical exploration, but it's also critically important that learners can write and talk about many of them and be able to navigate them in the real world. We can take action by adapting and supplementing our course materials with those that better reflect what our learners want and need to learn about in order to become engaged global citizens. In this way, our classrooms can be more than just safe spaces, but also brave spaces, where learners put on their critical lenses, are encouraged to be courageous, embrace discomfort, and engage with opinions and ideas that they might not share. A possible extension of the previous narrative is that because our teaching materials don't contain anything controversial, they are somehow value neutral in the way that they present the world. As we've already seen, language is not neutral, and nor are visuals or graphics. So the question of who and what is written about in course texts, the stories that are foregrounded, but also who is seen, who is heard, and who is missing from your course materials, reflects the values of the authors, which may be you, a colleague, your school, your government, or a global publishing company. As teachers, we need to be able to examine the materials that we put in front of our learners, and preferably together with them, identify and investigate the hidden curriculum. How is language used to reinforce or subvert dominant narratives within the materials? Who is included and who is excluded or othered? What socio-political structures and power relationships are present, whether explicitly or implicitly? How are materials culturally, socially, politically, and historically constructed and situated? And one final narrative connected to teaching materials, well, we know this isn't true. Yet, it's deeply embedded in our field. But we can challenge native speakerism every time we teach by including audio texts from a diverse range of expert users and making sure learners know why we're doing this, so that they can become intercultural users of the language and themselves promote and use English as the international language that it is. Here are 6 alternative suggestions for sources of audio and audio-visual texts, all of them freely available. They are, if you like, story casts, recordings of real people telling real stories and sharing their lived experiences. They include people from a diverse range of backgrounds and with a variety of different first languages and accents. In particular, I'd like to invite you to view and listen to the Hands Up Project podcast. Over the last 6 months, the team at the Hands Up Project, as well as members of the recently formed ELT Professionals for Palestine, have been working tirelessly to share the voices of our colleagues and students, their students, in Gaza. If ever there was a time that Palestinian voices needed to be heard, it is now. So please do listen and share. Let's move on to assessment. Many of the prevailing narratives surrounding materials in general also apply to the materials we use to assess. We should be cognizant of the different voices and representations in our input texts that we use when we're testing, for example. We can also explore how our learners are positioned by our existing assessment practices and discourses. Do our learners have any agency in when, how often, and how they are tested? Could course assessments be more participatory and democratic, for example, by allowing learners to choose the topic of a text, task types, the assessment criteria, who assesses them, or the type of feedback they will be given? Like our classroom materials, we can also question whether our test tasks respect different experiences of the world and identify hidden assumptions, for example, that candidates will be able to talk, write, or comprehend tasks about certain things that they may have little to no experience of, such as going on holiday, traveling by plane, or spending time with family. The last aspect of teaching practice I'd like to touch on here is classroom interaction. And a critical approach to this aspect of our practice raises a number of interesting questions. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire critiques the very distinction we make between teacher and student. Instead, he calls upon teachers to ask themselves what their learners can teach them, and suggests replacing the dichotomous roles of teacher and student with new terms, such as students as teachers and teachers as students. Eliminating the traditionally elevated status of the teacher in the classroom, Freire suggests, would result in a more participative dialogic education through which learners would be empowered and given agency over their own learning. Adopted wholesale, the Freirean vision would have huge implications for the way we both manage and experience our classes. However, if the complete eradication of your role as the teacher seems a little far-fetched, then at least consider the extent to which your classroom management style and the way you interact with your learners reinforces existing power dynamics. How authoritarian or democratic is your classroom management? How much agency do your students have to make decisions about how and what they study, and the rules or standards they're expected to adhere to? We also need to reflect on our teacher talk as well. In a classroom context, when the teacher dominates the floor or speaks from a position of authority on a subject, we reinforce a particular power dynamic that prioritizes our voice over those of our students. Does our teacher talk encourage inquiry and critical questioning? Do we give our students space to speak and be heard? And for whose voices are heard most in the classroom, apart from our own? In which languages are they allowed to speak? Do we elicit answers from male and female students equally? Do we support and encourage equal participation from other marginalized students, for example, those with lower socioeconomic status? On Wednesday, I went to a fantastic talk by Sarah and Lisa of Oracy Lab about the work they're doing around teaching oracy and speaking skills. Among the many benefits of oracy that they highlighted was how it can empower students with the belief that their voice has value, as well as supporting students to express their feelings, resolve conflicts, access employment, and engage in civic life. Research suggests that classroom talk can be influenced by gender. For example, male students tend to dominate classroom discussion, while female students tend to be chosen less often by teachers and interrupt less often than their male colleagues. So how we engage and support classroom talk has social justice implications. Not only should we critique our own practice, the language classroom is somewhere learners can be made more aware of conversational norms, the part we play in perpetuating them, and take action to disrupt the status quo. I'd now like to move on to the next layer of the model. This ring relates to institutions who are providers of English language teaching, so schools, colleges, universities, and so on. The activities they undertake in supporting teaching, such as teacher education and management. So let's first look at teacher education. Within IATEFL, I think there's a lot of really positive evidence of teachers adopting an increasingly critical approach to their work at a grassroots level. However, though I wish it was the case, I'm not sure that this is representative of English language teacher education and development more widely. Critical pedagogy of the sort I'm describing today isn't on the syllabus of many teacher training courses that I'm aware of, which is why I wrote one. In fact, the word critical doesn't even feature at all on the syllabus of one of the industry's most well-known teacher training courses. And this is obviously a choice made by providers of teacher education courses and qualifications. But the good news is that taking a critical approach to teacher education doesn't mean adding content to our already packed course timetables. Criticality can be woven into the fabric of language teacher training and development. All pre- and in-service development should be seen as a potential opportunity to facilitate and model critical conversations. As with teaching practice, we can also reflect on our teacher education materials. We're going to play a little game now, a game of spot the difference. That's right, there isn't much difference. They've all got blue covers. But in addition to this, you might also notice a certain lack of diversity among the writers. Brilliant though the authors of these books all are, and I've chosen these titles because they are quite rightly staples on many ELT certificate and diploma courses, are we ensuring that our reading lists showcase a wide range of expertise, including texts written by expert teachers from different backgrounds who work in a variety of different teaching contexts? In our work as teacher educators, we can also actively encourage teachers to critique dominant discourses, including those we perpetuate through our own training. This might feel uncomfortable because in the classroom, just like in the classroom, in the training room, we're used to holding positions of power. But as language is used to exercise power in the classroom in a multitude of different ways, it is also used to do so in the training room. Our own practice should be a model of openness to different approaches, for example, in the way we give and receive feedback, by incorporating the voices of other observing teachers, and of course, wherever possible, the students. Another way to offer up alternative perspectives is by sharing reading tasks, like these articles from Modern English Teacher magazine, which critique some of the more mainstream teaching practices that candidates are taught on some initial certificate courses. Let's move on to ELT management. There's obviously a lot that could be covered here, but I'm going to focus just on two issues. The first is teacher recruitment and native speakerism. And to illustrate the problem, I'd like to share an extract from an email that I received from a graduate of one of my courses. Reproduced with permission, I've highlighted some parts for emphasis. This is what they said. This email made me really sad. This is a skilled, talented, and committed individual who is a proficient speaker of English, but the status quo in our industry is such that they can't find a job without lying about who they really are. And sadly, they have since left the profession. What can we do to combat native speakerism in our institutions? I've seen some really fantastic, creative attempts to counter this dominant narrative. Teachers calling out native speakerism on job ads on social media, or in this image on the left, Laura Patsko's canvassing of an ad on a lamppost with post-it notes giving multiple reasons why not to trade on the term native speaker. One teacher even took a school in Germany to court for discrimination under EU law and won. But as with all issues of social injustice, this is not the responsibility of those discriminated against to take this work forward. If you speak English as your first language, be an ally. If you're financially able to, boycott jobs at institutions promoting native speakerism, stating exactly why it is you aren't going to be applying to their school. And if you work in teacher recruitment, remove discriminatory language like native, near native, or native-like from advertisements for teaching jobs. Instead, highlight the inclusive values that should set your institution apart by stating clearly on your teacher ads that you celebrate diversity, including linguistic diversity. If you're a manager, be proactive in drawing up clear, consistent, and well-communicated policies for inclusion and diversity in your schools that explicitly address native speakerism. Share and discuss them widely with your students, staff, and other stakeholders, like parents, so that your staff feels supported. And finally, the thorny issue of teacher pay and working conditions, something that doesn't get spoken enough about in public forums like ELT conferences, so I thought it would be silly of me to let this excellent opportunity go to waste. As a teacher and now as a freelance ELT training consultant, I've been directly and personally affected by some of these issues. Issues like poor wages, precarious contracts, expectations of unpaid labor, a lack of pay transparency. How can we resist this race to the bottom? As teachers and freelance teacher educators, talk to each other. Share and compare rates of pay and the type of work you are paid for. Do this within and between schools. If you can, join a union. And if you employ teachers, invest in us. We are the most important resource you have. Advertise a clear, transparent pay structure that takes account of qualifications, expertise, and experience, because this is how we address the gender pay gap and eliminate pay inequality. Pay us for CPD, teachers' meetings, and admin, because every lesson plan that we have to submit, every minute spent on record keeping and marking, reduces our hourly rate of take-home pay. This is how you show us that we're valued. Put us on permanent contracts on a fair wage so that we can afford to get a mortgage or start a family if we want to. Because this is how you retain great teachers in your school and in the profession as a whole. Show your teachers appreciation, because we don't want to go to work to feel burnt out, devalued, and disposable. Treat us like the professionals that we are. And finally, the outer ring of our model. Here we're widening out to include the organizations like those on the screen that are or have become or have sought to make themselves integral to the work of our field. Because I don't personally have experience in all of these areas, I contacted a number of colleagues who do and invited them to suggest some critical questions, questions that seek to disrupt our status quo. So thank you to everyone who took up the time to do this. Some of them are in the room. After such a wonderful, thought-provoking and engaging conference, I think these are the questions that we should be taking forward and considering in our work over the next year and well beyond. As you listen and reflect on them, I'd like you to think about your own role in ELT and the relevance of these issues to your context and the action that you can take. To what extent is English courses, English exams, teaching qualifications and CPD workshops and courses now just another product? What is the impact of the commodification of English having on program design and content? How does this position us as professional ELT practitioners? Whose English is it anyway? Who gets to decide who can teach it and what language level or qualifications are good enough? Exactly how much clout do some of these large, powerful organizations have and use in how individual schools operate? How do we identify and demolish the power structures that facilitate and fight to protect the dominance of native speaker teachers? How inclusive is international education and research when English is the dominant medium of instruction and publication? Can these powerful organizations, which are based mainly in the Western Centre, really address the needs of students and the work of teachers all around the world? How relevant are the services they offer, like teaching frameworks and prescribed standards of practice to teachers who live and work on the periphery? Or put another way, what's the sweet spot that balances meaningful support with the risk of cultural imperialism? How can we facilitate a recalibration towards wider, more inclusive professional bodies and communities and diminish the feelings of outsiders and insiders? Who really benefits from the ELT industry in its current form? How is English teaching contributing to the climate emergency? What does teaching English mean for other cultures and languages, particularly minority or endangered languages around the world? Within and outside of these organizations, is there space for us to raise some of these critical questions for the leadership to respond to? And if we do, will we be listened to? In what ways have some of these bodies actually contributed to the creation of many of the problems that they now purport to be solving? Do they acknowledge this? And are they taking meaningful action or just paying lip service to notions of decolonization or environmental sustainability? With only half a day of IATEFL left, we unfortunately can't answer all of these questions today. But I think we need to pose them and prioritize these conversations at this conference, within our association, and with everyone watching at home who cares about our field and how we use the personal power that we all have to seek positive change. The good news is that we are already. From Vicky's critical exploration of AI, issues of sustainability and the digital divide, to Zarina's emotive exploration of inclusion, intersectionality, and ethics, and yesterday, Letitia's references to empowerment, translanguaging, decentering ELT, not to mention the substantial number of excellent talks I've been lucky enough to go to this week that have included critical social justice themes. It seems that we are, as a field, thinking and talking about language and power. So, disrupt the commonplace, interrogate multiple viewpoints, focus on socio-political issues, and take action for social justice. In this talk, I've tried to show you how language can be used to construct, establish, and maintain power relations, but also how we can equally use language to deconstruct, critique, and challenge them, from the individual to the institutional, across multiple sectors within our field. Given how English has historically been spread around the world, I think, and I hope I've persuaded you, that we as English language educators should be specifically concerned with foregrounding critical literacy within our work. There's a quote I'd like to end with from the freedom fighter, activist, and former South African president, Nelson Mandela. It goes, "Education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world." And I hope if you take away anything from this talk, it's the unique potential and power of language education to do exactly this. Thank you.